All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to day two of the 2026 Culture of Data Conference brought to you by the Colorado Public Health Association. I'm Ben Leshock. I am one of the co-chairs for this year's event, alongside my fellow chair, Ann Hill, CPHA's Madison Wagner, and of course, the whole Culture of Data Committee, whose work was really essential in making this year's conference a reality. Um, I'd like to thank all of our other volunteers, the presenters, of course, as well as our attendees for making Culture of Data a success. At this challenging moment for public health, I think this year's theme of democratizing data and connecting with communities is more important than ever. I also want to extend our appreciation to all of our sponsors whose support helps keep Culture of Data possible. You'll continue to hear from them throughout the day. And to everyone in attendance, from all of us here at the Culture of Data team, we thank you for participating and closing out the conference with what promises to be a great day of conversations about what's happening in data and health equity across the state of Colorado. Right now, everyone is muted, but we will have some time for Q&A at the end of this session. I think we'll have about 20 minutes or so. So please be thinking about your questions. Feel free to put those in the chat as we go. We will collate all of those questions, and Dr. Manson will take those at the end. But also feel free to come off mute at the end. We want this to be as interactive as possible for all of you. Let's see. If you'd like to, just some Zoom housekeeping. Like I said, you're on mute. Please stay on mute until the Q&A session. If you'd like to rename yourself or add your pronouns to your Zoom square, you can click the three dots and use the rename function. So this year, we're rallying around a bold theme, the people's data, democratizing access, understanding, and use. Our speakers this year have and will bring stories that cut to the heart of why this work matters and challenge us to do more with the tools, data, and communities that we serve. And we hope that you'll leave with a renewed sense of purpose and a clear line of sight to the programs, projects, and people driving health equity forward, because really the future of this work is in your hands. So we hope that you come here ready to be energized and leave ready to act. It is now my great pleasure to welcome back Dr. Spiro Manson, who so thoughtfully moderated our opening panel yesterday, to give this year's keynote address titled Understanding, Accessing, and Using Data, Lessons from Native Communities. Dr. Manson is a distinguished professor of public health and psychiatry at the Colorado Trust Chair in American Indian Health at the Colorado School of Public Health, where he is also the director of the Centers for American Indian and Alaska Native Health. Dr. Manson, the floor is yours. I will pull up your slides.
Miigwech. Anibuju, in the words of my people, the Anishinaabe from the eastern woodlands and the northern plains, good morning. Wishing you a good day today. I'm just going to wait just a moment for the screen share. I'm going to invite you to join me in a journey across the landscape of nearly 40, almost 50 years of experience working with and hand in hand with American Indian and Alaska Native communities across the country. My plan today is, although it's specific for the most part in terms of the concrete examples, to share a series of stories that illustrate the lessons that I've learned within the framework that I'll describe in greater detail. I believe that many of those lessons generalize to the communities with whom we all work and are not necessarily entirely specific to Native communities. Next slide, please. So let's consider for a moment the genesis of the concern around what we call tribal data sovereignty and the importance of working through in a full and authentic partnership with Native communities to co-design and to co-implement and to co-disseminate the results of the work that our relationships engender and that is sought and valued by our community partners. In the case of American Indian and Alaska Native communities, there are two extremely clear examples that come immediately to mind. The first was the Barrow alcohol study in the late 1970s. It was carried out by the Institute of Man at Tulane University and generated a reporting called the Inupiat Economics and Alcohol in the Alaska North Slope. This particular study, which at least in its original form, was intended to describe the nature and extent uh, and impacts of alcohol abuse and dependence among the residents of Barrow, Alaska, but in fact, basically focused on the local indigenous population as a consequence of their great involvement and representation in the subset of the population impaired by alcohol abuse and dependence. That particular study was designed to try and understand not only the nature and extent epidemiologically of alcohol abuse and attempt and dependence, but also to trace its social, economic, psychological impacts on the community as a whole. The principal investigators for that study at a major conference sponsored by the American Psychiatric Association in mid-January of 1998 were interviewed, and that interview about the study, which they presented there, and it ran on the front page of the New York Times and also subsequently in the Washington Post. And that headline for this screamed, "Alcohol plagues Eskimos." And you can see here the investigators' assertions that the Inupiat of Alaska's North Slope, that their culture had been overwhelmed by energy development and activities, are practically committing suicide by mass alcoholism. So, not only outstripping by far the implications and the reasonable interpretation of their findings, which were flawed by the nature of the study design, the consequences in terms of stigmatizing the local community or this subset of it were substantial. But equally concerning was the fact, as a consequence of this, the Standard and Poor rating for Barrow, Alaska, dropped from an A plus level to a C level, costing the community itself, native and non-native, tens of millions of dollars in the availability of resources to sustain and improve the local infrastructure. Next slide, please. You can see here the extent to which the results of this study, which ironically, for the most part, was conducted within the jails and lockups in Barrow, Alaska, which were well known to overrepresent the local Inupiat population. You can see here the kind of data that were reported. Now, these data were reviewed and discussed with a subsegment of the local community, but did not take into account the nuances around who constitutes community and the way in which they were or were not involved. And I'll come back to that issue later in my remarks. Next slide. The second major study, a series of events relating to a study conducted in American Indian communities involved the Havasupai tribe and Arizona State University. The Havasupai tribe, deeply concerned about the onset of, and particularly onset and near epidemic proportions of diabetes among their tribal members, agreed in 1989 to collaborate with Arizona State University investigators to examine this subject. It involved drawing and testing biospecimens in their search for etiology or the causes for the elevated rates and consequences of diabetes. When there was among the first papers published on the work that unfolded in 1999, the investigators concluded that they were unable to identify a genetic reason for the high levels of diabetes that the tribe thought was at issue. Next slide, please. That aspect of it was less troubling than what subsequently followed. And specifically, what followed was the use of those biospecimens by a broad range of investigators from many other universities and institutions for purposes quite different from those originally communicated and agreed to by the Havasupai people. For example, they were used to examine the issue of ancestry, which came into immediate conflict with the Havasupai's own criteria for eligibility to be enrolled in the tribe. They looked at other kinds of issues that had not been anticipated in the original agreement between the tribe and Arizona State University, such as the onset of Alzheimer's disease and related dementia and the like. The tribe itself had little understanding and certainly no advanced knowledge and no opportunity to consider and to support these alternative uses of their data and the biospecimens, leading to headlines of the type that you see here at the top of this particular slide. Next slide, please. The consequences of that particular conflict led to litigation that lasted nearly a decade and ultimately was settled out of court to the benefit of the Havasupai people. However, there is no after the fact recovery truly, monetarily or otherwise, from the consequences of such widespread and deeply rooted violations of those agreements. This then spurred and was considered in the context of evolving understanding on the part of the federal government as well as states, and unfortunately and sadly, slowly to the level of awareness of universities and other institutions conducting such research about self-determination among American Indian Alaska Native communities, particularly those that are federally recognized. Self-determination assured by and reinforced through government-to-government relationships that are guaranteed, if you will, by the federal government as a result of the treaty relationships that had been negotiated, as failed and broken as those promises were throughout the late 1800s. And the federal government began to systematically acknowledge and to affect its way of doing business by ensuring that there was increasing expectation as well as requirement about the consultation with tribal governments at every phase of the work involving them. We saw this emerge initially in the Reagan years, in the American Indian policies, and then subsequently by George H.W. Bush in their respective presidencies. And actually, executive orders mandating that the federal government, particularly in encouraging their state counterparts, engage and operationalize these tribal consultations as a function of the government-to-government relationship. Next slide, please. These expectations and requirements have been consistently upheld and reinforced by subsequent presidents up to our current administration. We saw President William Clinton in his memorandum in April of 1994 take this mandate even further and infusing it throughout all aspects of the federal government, the various cabinets and agencies and organizations that touch the lives of tribal communities. Next slide, please. As a result, at that point in time, we saw the emergence of tribal community research review boards and institutional review boards that were initially chartered through the Indian Health Service, the major public health agency within the Department of Health and Human Services that is responsible as a consequence of these treaty-defined obligations for ensuring that the nature of its work that it sponsors is conducted consistent with these kinds of regulatory processes. And so we began to see the Navajo Nation Human Research Review Board emerge, the Oglala Sioux Tribal Research Review Board, and a cascading series of like organizations arise within tribal communities to provide frameworks by which to anticipate, understand, and to comply with these expectations as well as regulatory requirements. The interesting thing is the extent to which these research review boards blended not simply human subject protection measures, but also infused those research review board roles and responsibilities with overseeing the quality of the work being done, its relevance to the local priorities, and to ensuring at every turn possible the partnership with the tribal entities with whom investigative teams propose to work. Next slide, please. We saw with President George W. Bush, again, this series of executive orders become even more specific and broader in scope and tighter in expectations and requirements for regulatory compliance. Next slide, please. And it was with respect to President Obama, we saw the first major visit by a sitting president to tribal communities. In this particular case, the Standing Rock Sioux, whose reservation spans the north and south borders of the states of North and South Dakota, in which he, in person, visited these sites, reaffirmed even more strongly than his predecessors the federal government's commitment to tribal governance and the tribal sovereignty and the relationships of this type. President Obama's work led to even more specific tools that began to emerge within the Department of Health and Human Services for guiding the nature of this work. Next slide, please. And we can see them, for example, in the issuance in the early 2000s through the mid 2010 of NIH guidance on the implementation of Health and Human Service tribal consultation policy that provided a roadmap and specific guideposts by which to undertake these consultation processes and the expectations with respect to the types of conversations that need and must be held. We saw out of the Centers for Disease Control very explicit manuals and guideposts for consultation on key matters of public health and particularly public health research. We saw at the time Dr. Kathleen Sebelius, who was the secretary of DHHS, elaborate even more fully about how such guidelines should be enacted, resulting in a handbook issued by the Department of Health and Human Services, which was subsequently revised and elaborated on by the NIH and other agencies at that point in time. Next slide, please. So what we're seeing is the beginning and continued codification and concretization of these kinds of expectations and requirements for equity in the research process among tribal communities and the federal government. What the codification process through these community research and review boards and their respective institutional review counterparts were intended to do and have sought assertively is to continue the search for common ground among tribal communities and federal governments and the investigative teams seeking to undertake federally sponsored research among their membership. And this search for common ground has canvassed and surfaced major organizational, political, and cultural differences among tribal communities, the institutions and universities from which the investigative teams arise, and the research sponsors themselves, and underscored the complicated nature of this landscape. And it's here I'd like to return to a theme that we addressed in yesterday morning's really exciting panel about the nature of community. And I'd like to underscore for those of us here today that this notion of the community is not, as yesterday's panels uh, encouraged us to think, um, uh, well beyond simply a monolithic entity that is easily grasped and representative of all views. It was quite clear in our yesterday's discussion in the panel that community and this new notion of community is extremely nuanced. That community constitutes not only the constituents of the communities among whom proposed research is to be undertaken, but it also includes necessarily the community of science, that is, the universities and institutions to which these investigators belong, that have similar kinds of expectations, requirements, and a community of sponsorship. That if NIH and other CDC and other kinds of sponsors of research that have their own set of expectations and requirements, goals, and objectives from the research that they fund and expect to have broad impact from. So, what are some of the differences that have arisen that I have noted and have sought to navigate over the last nearly 5 decades? Next slide, please. Let's turn first to those that are organizational in nature. And it's easy, and I recognize that these are more um, clearly stated and in their statement belie the complexity and variation with respect to each of these respective entities, whether universities and federal government and sponsors or tribal communities, but think of them as major points to consider why these differences organizationally may arise. And I think it's important to have some guideposts like this because much of these differences reside out of awareness of all parties, and on the other hand, are deeply influencing of the nature, course, and outcomes of the kinds of negotiations and conversations that subsequently happen. So, in my experience, I have come to think of the organizational differences in the following way: that among universities and the federal government, and often sponsors of research outside of that federal um, context. Decision making is largely hierarchical, that it is rule driven, that the processes surrounding the decision making process emphasizes efficiency, replicability, and written document. I'm reminded here of one of my colleagues from a number of years ago exhorting us not to sacrifice the quality of our research, the nature of the engagement, and all the benefits that derive on the altar of efficiency and expediency. And I carry that lesson forward to this very day. In these particular contexts, leadership is often is formal, excuse me, and it's centralized. It often is expected and carried out as if it's context free, independent of the wide spectrum of different kinds of factors that inevitably shape the deliberation of how an organization, whether it be universities or the federal governments or other sponsors, think about and orchestrate the priorities and the decision-making processes and how they consider investing in this particular agenda. Analytic thinking is prominent and it assumes that there is an answer. It relates to this notion of objectivity, that there are things to be discovered that stand apart and are time independent. And then ultimately, one of the major organizational differences I have seen at work, springing from the university and federal government's perspective, is that instrumental competence, the administrative skills and knowledge to carry out this work are in and of themselves seen as products to be highly valued, and they assume that there is a universal standard for assessing project progress in this regard. Now, In counterpoint, in my experience, tribal communities and their derivatives have often quite different kinds of organizational processes, structures, and values. For example, in my experience among tribal communities, decision-making is frequently horizontal. It's precedent-oriented, and it's consensual by nature. I will tell you, although we didn't discuss this particular orientation among yesterday morning's panel, I heard it echoed throughout all three of the panelists' descriptions of how they are organized, how their mission and values are framed, and it is shared regardless of the racial and ethnic orientation of those particular communities that were represented yesterday morning. Secondly, among tribal communities, as it often is among others of a non-native origin, the process itself is fluid. It's iterative. It builds on itself over time, and it takes the lessons learned at one phase and adapts to the discussion and organizational process at subsequent phases. The critical events, key conversations are recorded for the most part and rendered historically in an oral fashion. And they are not measured so much by chronological time. They are benchmarked by key events that in this particular context mark evolution in the relationships among the entities that are involved in seeking to find common ground than they are in terms of the time required to do so. Here, among tribal communities, leadership is shared. It's diffuse and it's ascribed rather than attributed. It's very difficult to identify beyond the titular and ceremonial role, for example, of a tribal chair or a traditional chief or the chair of various tribal committees. And it's often mistaken that those positions, by virtue of the being occupied, operate in the same fashion organizationally as university, federal, and sponsor counterparts. Among tribal communities, the emphasis is on distributive thinking about this, about canvassing all of the different stakeholders or representatives within the tribal community and ensuring that those voices are heard and assuming that there isn't a single answer to a given issue or question, but it is, in fact, likely to be multiple options in terms of how to consider, reflect on, and address the issues of concern. And ultimately, that authority itself isn't rooted in the manner of organization, such as in the university and federal governments, but it's collective. It's about this notion of collective competence. And we've heard this phrase, collective genius, bandied about in the literature. And I truly believe that it, in fact, taps a major essence of the organizational, of the ways in which tribal communities organize themselves and bring those kinds of perspectives to bear on such issues. These then organizationally are, in my experience, at work on both sides of the equation, if you will, frequently unrecognized, often at the heart of the challenges in finding that common ground. Next slide. But there are other kinds of differences than organizational ones. They are political differences between universities and the federal government from those within tribal communities. Within universities and the federal government, we see a very clear emphasis that representation is a collective of individuals, of constituents, that the primary motive or the master motive, if you will, of behind the political dynamics is to govern objectively and to control individuals or the groups of which they are a part. This notion of control is really essential and takes us back to the organizational elements of most of these types of entities and the need for being able to continue to pursue this notion of a uniform approach that minimizes variation, which is seen as somehow noise, if you will. And I think we probably have all heard that in the context of research, that the mission is to reduce the amount of noise so that we can have presumably greater clarity about what everyone is being asked to commit to. Among universities and the federal government, in my experience, again, competence is seen as stemming from delegated authority and which has administrative license. Oh, well, that's my job. That's my responsibility. That falls within my wheelhouse, if you will, are phrases that I frequently hear from representatives of this side of the coin. Accountability, very strongly, is often couched in terms of blameworthiness and liability. There's a constant attempt to avoid liability, to minimize it, and in the face of prospective or realized liability, to shift the responsibility in a blaming-like fashion onto onto others. And lastly, that the compliance or obedience to the nature of of the politics involved is seen as obedience through instruction and compliance to these rules and regulations. Let's look at the flip side of the coin. Among tribal communities, representation is of an individual collective, of the body politic. I'll give you a wonderful example that proved to be quite thorny in the nature of our work. It was among a pueblo in the Southwest when we were undertaking a multi-site survey of, middle school and high school pueblo students in their local schools on a longitudinal basis, which sought to identify both the risks and protective factors from a variety of adverse consequences and conditions. Now, the National Institutes of Health, as a consequence of its very individualistic, person-centered approach, and requires through the informed consent process that individual participants, in this case, not only the students themselves, but their parents, if they were under the age of consent, individually had to be consented or assented. The Pueblo itself took great issue with that approach. They argued that, in fact, that person-centered, individualistic approach undermined the very nature of the principles by which they are organized and govern their collective membership. And they required that, they asserted, in fact, that they, as the governing council, as the body politic, if you will, representing these core values of the tribal committee, has the authority through its consensual processes to provide that consent and assent. And individual student and parental consent or assent were not necessarily, in fact, highly destructive of the internal fabric of the community. It took 3 years to navigate that particular set of political type of political differences to arrive at a mutually agreed solution, which ultimately went back to the issues of self-governance and tribal sovereignty and the various points of leverage that afforded this particular Pueblo community. Another key element in terms of the political differences revolves around the way in which tribal communities view the major objective of research and their relationship to their constituents. Specifically, that its objective as a collective is to manage interdependent relationships, not independent hierarchical ones. And that particular orientation has dramatic implications for how not only decision making is reached, but how subsequent enactment of the agreements take place. Tribal communities see that authority is not simply a matter of competence and delegation, but it is rooted in deeply moral and social responsibilities to the individual, to the membership of those communities. And that accountability, in turn, is framed not as a requirement, but as a moral obligation. And it requires the assent and acceptance by others within that community. And ultimately, from the point of view of most tribal communities, they aspire to conformity through adherence to shared values. So that when you're in these conversations with tribal communities, there is a frequent and constant reference to the core values that are shared, that are people are reminded that drive and fuel the nature of research and its support activities, and is the reason for pursuing research in the first place. Then the third set of political of differences, next slide, please, Ben, are cultural in nature. Although all of these aspects are are threaded by matters of culture. So in the non-tribal world, it tends for the most part, as I've indicated, to be person-centric. In sharp contrast to tribal worldviews, would tend to be sociocentric. We have, for example, an understanding that the societies, whether they be Euro-American or tribal in nature, array themselves along a spectrum from those that are quite person-centric in orientation to those are what we call very social-centric in orientation, and options in between. And the differences in terms of where a community, an organization, the partners to these negotiations lie, has major implications for the kinds of conversations that will be held. The non-tribal world really prizes privacy and anonymity, where in fact the tribal perspective seeks cooperation and de-emphasizes conflict, and as a consequence requires identity and involvement. The notion of personal identity and shared personhood arise here, and they are strong forces at work in terms of shaping the kinds of expectations, preferences, and orientation in tribal communities. Now, in the non-tribal world, we're typically goal-directed and value problem solving. Now, I will tell you, my wife, who's an internist, is German, and I'm American Indian. I can tell you that my personal experience in navigating the differences culturally and organizationally are enormous at the level of trying to find common ground between my wife's deep commitment to being goal driven and solving problems. For the most part, I, on the other hand, am more as concerned, even more committed to stressing that the process is as important, if not ultimately more so, than the endpoints that may be seen as desirable. And so tribal communities really do stress mutuality and belonging and engagement, and this notion of involvement and solidarity. These kinds of orientations outweigh and temporize many of the goals that we may bring to these conversations in trying to negotiate and discover common ground. I think for the most part, and this is a time-worn one, but I believe it is, in my experience, quite true, that many in the non-native world perceive time as a commodity, not to be wasted. Oh, how often do we hear that? Well, let's not waste our time doing this, that, or the otherwise. That it is a limited commodity, and it is something to be managed. Now, in tribal communities, there's a much greater caution and deliberation and patience with respect to this notion of time. And it's again marked, not chronologically, but by the unfolding of events that are seen as markers of the adherence and the enactment of the core values that drive the deliberation process and ultimately the commitment of tribal communities to a shared agenda. Next slide, please. So these kinds of differences bring us to very practical matters regarding points of tension between these two orientations. One point of tension has to do with the review and approval of research itself. How are the basic questions that will be the focus of this work surfaced? How do we acknowledge their importance and priority? How do we think about the kinds of designs that are appropriate to be collaboratively pursued and implemented? Um, to whom the data belongs that will emanate from these kinds of things? That has been a thread throughout all the conversations in this conference, in this series of meetings, as well as historically. And this notion of tribal data sovereignty has become even more salient in today's world as a consequence of the kinds of case examples I began my remarks with. There are matters of tension around the distribution of resources. Why should you, as the university, have the vast majority of the resources? We in tribal communities see research not only as addressing some of the key concerns that we have and our constituents embrace, but also as a possibility, as a possible resource for employment, for capacity building, for advancing the developmental trajectories of our members in our community in terms of the ability to ascend to the kinds of roles that you at universities hold presently. And I use this you royally because I have a foot in both of these worlds. I've already discussed that the manner of informed consent is a major point of tension. How many of us recognize and have experienced personally as well as professionally the obfuscating and complicated nature of the language surrounding the research protocols that inform these informed consent processes? You know, if we actually subject those informed consent forms to the kind of rigorous scrutiny that we expect of the research itself that they're intended to permit and characterize, I suspect we would find that there's not much understanding or comprehension of the terms and conditions of those informed consent forms, of the nature of the work, and the expectations that evolve from them. Nature and extent of accountability and control is a huge point of tension in tribal communities and in attempting to navigate this landscape. In many communities, tribal communities, as a consequence of these community-based research review boards and IRBs, we now have codified expectations and requirements about the review and approval annually and on an ongoing basis as the products of this work begin to emerge, with veto power by the tribal communities over the release of those products, especially if they have not adequately engaged in an authentic fashion the tribal members of the communities involved. Interestingly enough, I've often heard major debates among my colleagues in the academy insisting that this is a violation of academic freedom and flies in the face of the expectations that they bring and are afforded in these contexts. Well, and the irony is, in my experience now over the last 30 years of seeking to engage tribal review boards and IRBs, I have found that in fact that review process has improved the quality of the science by ensuring that we as investigators, as scientists, are privy to and are held accountable for incorporating the insights and the observations that are available through collaboration with our tribal partners. I have found that the sampling strategies are much more robust and better informed and more likely to attain the recruitment and retention goals than otherwise would be the case. I have found that the notion of the theories that underpin the nature of this work are enhanced and elaborated, that key constructs that we as in the Academy may never have anticipated, much less recognized, hold enormous promise for increasing the validity of the work and the interpretation of the findings. And as importantly, the dissemination of this work and the ways in which it moves to translation and local impact, and the lessons learned can be made available to others, native or non-native, have really substantially benefited. And ultimately, one of and last of the six major points are the requirements around continued collaboration. The expectation that we in the Academy, those of us seeking to engage tribal communities in this research process as a matter of shared governance, will be there for the long term. And it's so tried but true about this notion of helicopter research, about simply being in and out in a period of time. We have to be prepared to the extent we're among members of the community of science to go well beyond what we were trained to do in our professional preparation. For example, I annually testify before the federal government and Congress and with state legislatures about not only the science and the rigor and the value of the work conducted jointly, but also work hand in glove with these tribal communities in identifying and justifying the relevance of these findings for the continued support as well as new initiatives that are so important to their membership. Next slide, please. So there have been a number of extremely concrete solutions to how to navigate these differences and to arrive at common grounds. One of them, and I just have a couple of examples illustrated here, has to do with data use agreements. I'm stunned by the extent to which many of my peers in the academy rail about the fact that they have to comply with and have no knowledge and cite the worst case examples about the challenges and the resistance to their particular views about how to use, control, and access and ultimately disseminate the results of this work. And we have now a burgeoning library of examples of how data use agreements can be, with increasing efficiency, to use the guidepost frequently valued by most of my peers, um, uh, uh, to develop and identify the terms and conditions by which data will be acquired and used and for what purposes and who can use it. And I think these data use agreements that were only recently part driven by tribal sovereignty and data sovereignty and the kinds of government to government relationships I described earlier are beginning to emerge with very concrete examples of how we can codify these kinds of common ground, agreements around common ground. Next slide, please. We have within NIH itself, for those of us and the Centers for Disease and Control, very explicit forms of governance and mechanisms by which to ensure that these kinds of issues are recognized and attended to in an ongoing fashion. We have, for example, the recent establishment of the Tribal Advisory Committee out of the Office of the Director of the National Institutes of Health that has membership across the major regions and service areas of the Indian Health Service to ensure that the voices of those communities are heard and directly accessible. We have, for example, now new tools through the Office of Tribal Health Research within the National Institutes of Health that categorizes and reports on the nature and extent and the distribution of the research funded by NIH and provides more ready access to the individuals in the academy as well as in these communities who have joined together in undertaking this work. Next slide, please. We have two emerging policies from the National Congress of American Indians Policy Research Center that provides a handbook for how to pursue these kinds of collaborations, and with the All of Us Research Program, which is a three-part focus on lifestyle, clinical conditions, as well as genetics, um, um, provides a very detailed document for how to pursue meaningful collaborations with tribal populations. And I very proudly serve as the co-chair for this particular work group. Next slide, please. So there is a burgeoning literature, both aspirational as well as increasingly concrete, in the guidance offered about how to negotiate and navigate these organizational, political, and cultural differences to discover common ground that allows us to move forward in ways that meet the agendas, perhaps not entirely of all partners, but substantially so. And we're seeing that the lessons learned from this are building towards increased opportunities for shared governance and improving the nature of the science and the productivity of that science, not just in terms of the classic publications and grants, but also in terms of the kinds of benefits that accrue to the people who participate in that work. So I know that this is fairly specific to American and Alaska Native communities, but I submit to you that many elements of this are shared in the negotiations among many communities of all types and sponsors and universities alike. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Manson, for a fantastic presentation. Um, we are now going to transition into our Q&A section. So if you have any questions, please put them into the chat. I think I see a couple of questions and comments rolling in already. I think I'll start it off if I'll take the committee chair's privilege and ask my own question first. So I thought this was really fantastic, Dr. Manson, and we have so many opportunities, I think, to improve how we're involving community. But I want to go back to this idea that came up yesterday, and you mentioned again today, of how are we defining community? And I think, when I look at who's on the call today, I see a lot of folks from local public health agencies as well as the state health department. And I'm thinking a little bit about categorical funding in public health. I think upwards of 80 or 90% of our funding is categorical and reduced down to disease status or health behavior. And so really, in so many instances, our notion of community as public health practitioners is predefined for us. So how might we, given that that's probably the nature of our funding for the time being, how might we expand on that notion of community? How might we decenter disease status or health behavior to kind of take this broader view of community? And how might we maybe advocate to funders or sponsors that we should take a broader view?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you for it, Ben. So let me talk in specifics as well as some broader generalities. First off, for 18 years, I directed the nationwide Special Diabetes Program for Indians demonstration initiatives, the purpose of which was to examine the extent to which then evidence-based practices in the prevention of diabetes, as well as the reduction of cardiovascular complications due to diabetes, could be implemented and evaluated within tribal communities. And in that particular instance, there were 136 urban, rural, and reservation communities involved with enormous differences among them, just simply as a matter of place. And the biggest challenge we had, but it provided for an extremely open-ended, iterative process of collective decision making among those 136 awardees, if you will. And one of the first initial challenges we had is that virtually all of the awardees were so socialized into categorical funding. They had difficulty understanding and embracing the fact that that particular initiative actually allowed enormous flexibility in terms of the allocation of the fiscal resources to the different kinds of programmatic tasks that the awardees themselves deemed essential to the successful implementation of those of the implementation of those evidence-based practices into their adaptation. That was one of the first major challenges that we faced. So I don't want to place it entirely on the sponsors, but I also believe that we, in terms of our community organizations, because of the constraints historically on how we've had to respond to categorical funding, has led initially to, in this case of the SDPI, feelings of initial suspicion. Do they really mean that we have this much flexibility? How can we think about doing that? And I'm impressed that we were able, but it took several years to get past the awardees understanding that there was truly this kind of flexibility with ultimate limits on it, but so much greater than previous precedent would lead one to believe. And secondly, we saw enormous benefits to the science of evaluating their subsequent efforts, so that we saw the evidence-based practices being tailored to local implementation in ways that categorical funding in itself, with its rigidity, would never have allowed, with enormous benefits to the science as well as to the translation. So that in SDPI, really as a function of these tribal communities, we were able collectively to match the original efficacy trials outcome of 57% reduction in risk of diabetes. That is phenomenal when you consider that the efficacy trials themselves were adherent to this very rigid kind of set of criteria, and the pragmatic trials, if you will, of SDPI match that. And it just underscores the opportunity and the benefit available to us by thinking more flexibly. Also, too, yesterday, Casey, forgive me, I've forgotten Casey's last name, one of the three panelists. And I would encourage everyone to, if you didn't attend the panel, to go to the recording. Casey gave a wonderful example of how, through her community-based organization and working with their constituents, they were able to, I think it was CDPHE, convince CDPHE that they did not need to invest yet again in a needs assessment, that in fact they and their constituents had a long history of needs assessment and data collection efforts that addressed the expectations around this condition of award, and that the award itself and the constituents would benefit from the reallocation of those resources assigned to that particular task to other tasks. And so I think it was a great example locally of how, when we engage with one another, we're open to what the nature of evidence may be, understand and be more flexible about appreciating how this information can be shared and is relevant, to how we can begin to shed the shackles of categorical funding. So, but it's an interesting process. We've not had much of a history of how to do that in our respective communities. We are likely to stumble. It's important that the sponsors understand that the stumbling is a part of the learning process together that we have to engage in. This whole notion of failing forward, as well as assuming in retreat, is extremely important in my opinion.
I think, yeah, learning is such a fantastic way to frame this exercise of it is expected that, this we won't know exactly how this will go, but we'll figure it out. Um, Again, I invite folks to either raise your hand, come off mute, or put your questions in the chat. Um,
But Ben,
I think oh, go
to
ahead.
go back to your point about trusting in the process, that's
Mhm.
not so easy if you reflect on the organizational cultural differences that are at
Right,
work here.
right.
Native people, and I think many of the communities represented here, do trust in a process. I think most sponsors, for a variety of reasons, not unfounded, are quite anxious about trusting in the process.
Right. No, I think your points about accountability and liability, and this notion of blameworthiness, are absolutely spot on. As a former local public health person, the risk aversion really is striking. And even now being in private philanthropy, where in principle you have a lot more flexibility, there's still this notion of risk aversion and reputational kind of oh, I don't even know how to say it. But we're worried about making mistakes versus
Yeah.
learning from mistakes or missteps along the way.
Right.
Absolutely.
And Ben, I'm
Uh,
surprised you characterize yourself as a former public health worker.
yeah, former governmental public health worker. I am absolutely, I proudly wave the public health flag, even though I'm in philanthropy now. I think on that point, Dr. Manson, I'll speak to my own experience. But like I said, there's a lot of local and state public health folks on the call. I was in both program management roles as well as research and evaluation. And I felt like we had a great relationship with our sponsors at the state, especially. And we were able to kind of have that exchange around categorical funding, or, let's look upstream. Let's not just look at tobacco use, but let's look at what predicts tobacco use. And I felt like we had a great relationship there. Um, and I think, I'll say, I had a sincere desire and interest in being more community oriented, being more community informed, particularly in our data and evaluation practices. And for context, I worked for the Denver Department of Public Health. Um, and it's, a large, diverse urban community. And I didn't really know where to start with these conversations, and who to reach out to. And even though we had dedicated community engagement folks at the department, which I know many smaller departments do not have, even with that, a very highly resourced health department, it still was challenging to know where to start. So I guess, and you mentioned one resource at the end of your presentation about for engaging tribal communities. There are some guidebooks, there are resources on how to get started. But I think just at the highest level, what would you say to those of us who sincerely want to do this work but don't know where to start?
Well, your elaboration brings to mind the notion of risk tolerance and risk aversion. And I think in terms of Venn diagrams of through this process of negotiation, identifying the overlap in risk tolerance among the principal parties and identifying one or two initially relatively lower risk actions and, and so that it doesn't it doesn't potentially compromise the entire agenda and relationship. But I often find that representatives of these different views are more likely to negotiate and compromise and to accommodate relatively smaller risks and to build upon the successes as well as failures that may subsequently emerge.
That's great. I think just, yeah, lowering the temperature sounds like a great way to start rather than risking it all.
Yep.
We've got a question in the chat. I see Christy just came on video, but I will go to Sean in the chat first. So Sean says, in my local public health agency, we've been struggling in organizing ourselves around a data governance structure, and seems that much of what you touched on, like the points of tension, could be handled in such a structured data policy. Would you agree that that could be a good way to manage some of the issues that you address?
So, yes, I agree that they can. And that's in fact why I wanted to highlight these data use agreements as one very concrete example of data use access and control policy. Um, why a data use agreement? At some point, these kinds of conversations have to get down to very concrete decisions, right? And holding out a data use agreement and arriving at the mutually acceptable terms and conditions of that bring a level of specificity and concreteness to the conversation that I think allows people to respond to more constructively. It takes it out of the realm for the most part, although the background of these differences is still there. It gets us focused earlier on the kinds of things that ultimately matter, but it still requires very careful reflection and analysis about one's own set of preferences and orientations that we may bring to the negotiation of these data use agreements. Now, you've seen one data use agreement, you've seen one data use agreement, right? And because they should and necessarily um, reflect the local circumstances. So I agree, Sean, that things like data policies, but moving it down, data policies is still at a level of abstraction that allows for a lot of unspoken uncertainties. Data use agreements are the next logical step down from policies per se that require us to focus very specifically on concrete ways to enact those policies.
Thank you, Dr. Manson. And just from my own experience, and you mentioned this, these agreements can take some time to hammer out. In a past life, I worked on one for 2 years and it never got past the lawyers. So that's also a potential outcome of all this. Christy, please go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Ben, and thanks for the great talk this morning and the great conference. I think it's been really great. I have spent a lot of my career working on the environmental justice of the health equity and environmental justice lens. And I think I just wanted to first point out that I'm drawing a lot of analogies between concerns we hear in disproportionately impacted communities with the ones we're hearing with tribal communities, right? In terms of the things that you all as government think are important are not the things that we necessarily think are important, right? And I want to recognize that environmental public health has been both in terms of providing like basic needs like food supplementation, things like that, right? But also in terms of healthcare and in terms of environmental health, have provide healthcare to the entire nation, and it's really important. I think people lose sight of that when it's not a big deal, and I think they get frustrated with us when we come to them with a one-size-fits-all solution. Now, that has helped us. It's helped us make great progress in terms of moving the needle on things like lead poisoning, right? In terms of air quality, right? It's really helped us. But I think what we hear time and time again from communities is that the one-size-fits-all solution isn't working for us, right? And I think I'd be curious as to thoughts on how we can scale not just the research, but the solutions for people. I spend a lot of my time working in risk assessment, where I think about mostly chemical risk, but I'm thinking a lot more about other risks too. And in environmental public health, we're managing exposures to manage public health risks. And I think we may be able to benefit from a broader view on thinking about what are the hazards in this community, what are the impacts to this community, and what are the actions. So when we're doing research, what are those actions that can be taken both from a policy level and individual level? And also, how do we resource those, right? I think in government, we're guilty of saying things like, oh, it's a bad air quality day, so, there's a wildfire in the area, close your windows, go inside. But for a lot of people, that's not a possibility, right? And so thinking about how do we make sure those solutions that we have are tailored to fit the needs of everybody. So I would be curious, thoughts on how we can work within the bureaucratic siloed system that we have to think about, we have these rules, we have these programs. How do we, if our funding agencies aren't going to do that, how do we work together at the state level or the local level, right, to make those connections and bring together that more holistic package to community, I think. So I think that's something that I think about, and I'd be curious as to what people think about that. And I think in terms of just sharing data overall, I think we all are subject to the same federal, well, I think most of us are subject to the same federal rules around PII and HIPAA. And I think just like all of our other data systems, we need a systematic, modern way of doing that in a way that makes sense for everyone. Because I think I've been involved in probably 40 different data use agreements on the same types of data, right? But just being used for slightly different purposes, right? So I think they serve a really good purpose in terms of informed consent, but I think having the data structure modernized so that we can adapt and can use more modern systems with data would help all of us as well. So I really think we have to think about both the how do we ensure that we have the right data protections, but also how do we do that in a modern way so that we're not spending 2 years. I mean, if it's a negotiation about why we're sharing data and what specific elements we're sharing, right? I think there's that. But if it's we're both public health agencies trying to do public health work, right? I think there are opportunities to accelerate those. So I would be curious as to sort of thoughts on how do we turn this into actions for us, right? And how do we integrate this cultural relevance, these differences into actions that we can take, especially given the policy framework that we have right now, because changing federal policy is nearly impossible.
So, Christy, you asked at least 5 or 7 questions.
Sorry. And I'm so curious about this topic.
It's wonderful. And I think you answered your own questions for the most part. I think a meaningful answer boils down to specific circumstances. You mentioned, for example, indoor air quality, and I've worked among Alaska Native communities in the remote interior, in which wood burning and other sources like that are the major ways of heating in many of those villages, and some of the challenges that poses for the more conventional forms of managing indoor air quality, and the state and federal agencies responsible for not only the standards, but the funding to address the requirements. Also, too, among the Montana tribes and the increased arsenic in the rivers that threaten the trout and other fish that live there, that the communities are very much dependent upon economically in terms of tourism, as well as their own diet, or the PCBs that have polluted the St. Lawrence waterways, in which many of the northeastern tribes depend for their livelihood. In each case, it's, again, I think going back to recognizing the potential differences, the need to engage. Being one, I think there are a couple of critical lessons. Suspending judgment long enough to allow the process to unfold. I find that many of us on all sides of the coin are too quick to judge the merits, feasibility, and desirability of a variety of different kinds of solutions to problems that we've identified. So suspending judgment long enough to critically reflect on one's own thinking that one brings to those conversations. I think a lot of us don't have the kind of individual awareness of what we bring to those conversations, whether we own it personally or it's a function of our organizations. And as you pointed out, I think where the rubber hits the road is that once we've achieved these kinds of relationships and begin to move forward on such agendas, that we're there to advocate, to represent the need for change, policy, funding-wise, et cetera, within our agencies and others, and as well as in other spheres of influence. Those are the things that immediately come to mind, but I think echoing your earlier comments, you anticipated them all.
All right. Thanks everybody for your participation in the Q&A. We are over time, so that's a great sign. I love that we have unanswered questions. That tells me that everyone was engaged. Please give it up for Dr. Spiro Manson once again for an excellent lecture, as well as for moderating our panel yesterday. Can't say enough how much we've appreciated your time and expertise here, Dr. Manson. Slides are available on Sched, the online platform. You will be receiving an evaluation today, either through a QR code or via email. Please do that evaluation. It really helps us improve the conference year over year. And otherwise, we will see you in about 12 minutes for the next concurrent lecture session. So thank you, everyone, and good health to you all.
Thank you all for allowing me to join you today.